Peter Hill Explains, where I invite you to join the science teaching conversation with me about Immanuel Kant. This is episode 12 of what's turning out to be an epic reading of the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Obviously, it goes in much deeper than most people are comfortable with. I can see a lot of people just switch through the podcast, switch off. So I'll try and keep it interesting. Previously, we had worked out that people wanted to do the, I think it's greatest good, ultimate good, the full-on good, which you might call it. And he had sort of gone through philosophy, based mostly in his own head, it looks like, going forward and working out that I think it's the greater good, being able to work for the greater good, the moral framework to do it, to identify it, so you've got an aim and focus in it. And then he said, well, look, the only people really qualified to that are those people who've actually gone through the process of believing in God and believing in a soul, the critical starting components. And you have to take that with a grain of salt, because he uses arguments which are correct for the time. However, we now know, say, for his self-consciousness, he does not have subconsciousness. For various things, the various frameworks of looking at things, he gets things right. I think people get things right by doing formal logic, mathematics, and he's sort of done a conceptual mathematics, in my opinion. This is Kant, a German up here, and he's done a conceptual mathematics of concepts to derive something, and some of the working and variables seem a bit out of whack, i.e. calling in for the existence of God, to allow a one method of finding a solution. I don't think that's a good, solid solution which underpins our society today. But it's just one solution. It doesn't preclude, in the way that I feel, there are other solutions, and it plays into modern physics and modern science, but it doesn't actually get its head around, I suppose, even special relativity or quantum mechanics. Although there's certain aspects which lead to that. So this is the final section, and I hope I can get to read it. It'll be a long one, and it's called The Unity of Nature and Freedom. This final section, briefly discusses how Kant attempts to unify the theoretical and practical parts of his philosophical system in the critique of the power of judgment. Okay, bear in mind he is basically rescuing religion, so religion took on board Newtonian mechanics, and that's sent cracks throughout the entire ship of religion. He's gone around and plastered it with logic. In the preface and introduction to the critique of power of judgment, Kant announces that his goal in the work is to, quote, bring his entire critical enterprise to an end, unquote, by bridging the, quote, gulf or, quote, chasm that separates the domain of theoretical philosophy, discussed mainly in the Critique of Pure Reason, for the domain of practical philosophy, discussed in the Critique of Practical Reason. In his words, quote, the understanding legislates a priori for nature as objects of the senses for a theoretical cognition of it in a possible experience. Now, I should say legislate, the way that he uses it, is the definition of moral laws held by everyone. Reason legislates a priori for freedom and its own causality, a supersensible in the subject for an unconditioned practical cognition. The domain of concept of nature under the one legislation and that of concept and freedom under another are entirely barred from any mutual influence that they could have on each other by themselves, each in accordance with its fundamental laws, but the great chasm that separates the supersensible from the appearances. So what you can think abstractly and what you can actually sense. And of course, we've done a lot of psychology since 1806 or 1804, when Kant wasn't Kant anymore. Kant couldn't, after 1804, because he was dead. So you can see that he's trying to work these two philosophical points. It's almost like the death throes of religious reasoning, but I'm sure it keeps on going. It's so complex that it's sort of been a fertile group. And so my view is that Kant is a very fertile philosophical compost for other philosophies to grow in. That's my view. Though it's a bit radical, and I'm sure people who like Kant will be offended by me saying that. Well, one way to understand the problem Kant is articulating here is to consider it once again in terms of the crisis of enlightenment. So this is, if you can think for yourself, why do you need God? The crisis was that modern science threatened to undermine traditional moral and religious beliefs, and Kant's response is to argue that, in fact, these essential interests of humanity are consistent with one another when reason is granted sovereignty and practical reason is given primacy over the speculative reason. Actually, that's probably a good argument. But the transcendental idealist framework transcendental idealism is Kant's idea of sort of the actual core working philosophy, within which Kant develops this response seems to purchase the consistency of these interests at the price of sacrificing a unified view of the world and our place in it. If science applies only appearances, while moral and religious beliefs refer to things in themselves or the supersensible, that is, what you can think in your head as abstract, then how can we integrate these into a single conception of the world that enables us to transition from one domain to another? Kant's solution is to introduce a third a priori cognitive faculty, which he calls the reflecting power of judgment, that gives us a teleological perspective of the world. I suppose a teleological, I think, is theological. It's teleological. It's a system of God belief. I think I remember. I've got to look at that many, many times. I suppose the objective here is for me to just build up my background cognitive skills in reading, but also in remembering things. It's a real struggle for me to go through and think through and actually get up multiple choice questions. Reflecting judgments provides the concept of teleology, and the purposiveness that bridges the chasm between the nature and freedom, and thus unifies the theoretical and practical parts of Kant's philosophy into a single system. It's interesting that Kant says that you have to have people freed. If they're not free and you force them to do actions, there's actually you have a moral decline. It is important to Kant that a third faculty, independent of both understanding and reason, provides this mediating perspective, because he holds that we do not have adequate theoretical grounds for attributing objective teleology to nature itself, and yet regarding nature as teleological solely on moral grounds that only heighten the disconnect between our scientific and moral ways of viewing the world. Let's take a break here to look up teleology or finality. Teleology, and that's the basic Greek thinking of what's the cause of everything. So where it says theology, it's a causal. What's the origin story? What's the origin story of philosophy and thought experienced by here? So just reading the last sentence again. Theoretical grounds do not justify us in attributing objective theology origin to nature. I'm going to use the word origin thought instead of teleology, because it is not a condition of self-consciousness that our understanding constructs experiences in accordance with the concept of teleology, or concept story, or origin story, causal story, which is not among Kant's categories or the principles of pure understanding that ground the fundamental laws of nature. That's why his theoretical philosophy licenses us in attributing mechanical causation to nature itself. In this respect, Kant is sympathetic to the dominant strain in modern philosophy that banishes final causes from nature, instead treats nature as nothing more than matter in motion, which can be fully described mathematically. So this is again, teleology is the cause a rock falls because it wants to get to the ground. It's got some personality. I like the ground, I'm going there. I like other rocks, rock love. But Kant wants somehow to reconcile this mechanistic view of nature with the conception of human agency that is essentially teleological, which I do think we actually think of our cause. We construct our story as consistent with our previous story. As we saw in the previous section, Kant holds that every human action has an end and that the sum of all moral duties is to promote the highest good. It is essential to Kant's approach, however, to maintain the autonomy of both understanding, in brackets in nature, and reason in morality, without allowing either to encroach the other's domain, and yet to harmonize them in a single system. This harmony can be orchestrated only from an independent standpoint, from which we do not judge how nature is construed objectively. That job of understanding, or how the world ought to be, job of reason, but from which we merely regulate or reflect our cognition in a way that enables us to regard it as systematically unified. So this is actually, there's an area of philosophy that I worked on called quadrains, that is A, not A, which is B, the relationship between A and B, A and not A, and the conception, the fourth level is the conception of that relationship, your concept of that relationship. So from a concept you can draw up 4 concepts, 4 subcategories. So the concept, not the concept, the relationship between the concept and not the concept, and the awareness of that relationship. So there's a mathematical word for that, but I don't know how this fits into modern philosophy. But it's very interesting when you actually do any object or any counting system that automatically generates a concept of a universe set. So if I have an apple and then I have the rest of the universe is not the apple, a relationship between the apple and the not rest of the apple, and my conception of it, because you create a new thing. When you create a boundary of an apple, you create automatically not the apple, and you can create a relationship between apple and not apple. They can't be the same, and then you create an awareness. It's very hard. It's almost like particles. You've got to create an antiparticle with it. Okay. According to Kant, this is the task of reflecting judgment, whose priori principle is regarded nature as purposive or theological, but as a regulative principle of the faculty of cognition. I think I'll pay that one. 7.2, the responsiveness to nature. So this is I've done everything, now I'm trying to bolt everything together. In the critique of power of judgment, Kant discusses 4 main ways in which reflecting judgment leads us to regard nature as purposive. First, it leads us to regard nature as governed by a system of empirical laws. Second, it enables us to make aesthetic judgment. Third, it leads us to think of organisms as subjectively purposive. And fourth, it ultimately leads us to think about the final end and nature as a whole. I think in terms of numeracy of concepts, once you get to 4 concepts as a basic stability, for me, our local curriculum, or Bloom's taxonomy, is a 3-level system, and this is just numerically, any system you look at, if it gets to 4 levels, I think it's good. 3 levels, it can be pretty bad and wrought to corruption. So 3 is corrupt, 4 is good. It's just my analysis of different systems. My analysis of syllabus having a 3-level system is intrinsically open to corruption. Okay, first, reflecting judgments enable us to discover empirical laws of nature by leading us to regard nature as if it were a product of intelligent design. Whoa. We do not need reflecting judgment to grasp the a priori laws of nature based on our categories, such as event every event and cause. But in addition to these a priori laws, nature is also governed by particular empirical laws, such as that fire causes smoke, which cannot know without consulting experience. To discover these laws, so laws is a basic pattern that you can observe in nature. I have to reread a textbook on what are laws. Laws is fundamental behaviour. A description. A law is description. It's not an explanation. In science, it is. Laws. To discover these laws, we must form hypotheses and devise experiments on the assumption that nature is governed by empirical laws that we can grasp. Slightly different use of the scientific word of law compared to what he's thinking. Reflecting judgments makes this assumption through its principle to regard nature as purposive for our understanding, which leads us to treat nature as if its empirical laws were designed to be understood by us. Oh God, that's really dangerous. Since the principle only regulates our cognition but not the constitutive of nature itself, this does not amount to assuming that nature really is the product of intelligent design, which, according to Kant, we are not justified in believing on theoretical grounds. It's interesting. Intelligent design is knocked away by Kant. Rather, it amounts only to approaching nature in the practice of science as if it were designed to be understood by us. We are justified in doing this because it enables us to discover empirical laws of nature. But it is only regulative principle of reflecting judgment, not a genuine theoretical knowledge. The nature is purposiveness in this way. Second, Kant thinks the aesthetic judgments about how beauty and sublimity involved a kind of purposiveness, and that beauty of nature in particular suggests to us that nature is hospitable to our ends. There's theories today about this, about why our universe and multi-universe is so finely tuned. According to this aesthetic theory, we judge objects to be beautiful not because they gratify our desires, since aesthetic judgments are disinterested, but rather because apprehending their form stimulates what he calls the harmonious, free play of our understanding and imagination, in which we take distinctly aesthetic pleasure. So beauty is not a property of objects, but a relation between their form and the way our cognitive faculties work. Well, okay, we say that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Good on you, Kant. Yet we make aesthetic judgments that claim insubjective validity because we assume that there is common sense that enables all human beings to communicate aesthetic feelings. Beautiful art is intentionally created to stimulate the universally communicable aesthetic pleasure, although it's effective only when it seems unintentional. Natural beauty, however, is unintentional. Landscapes do not know how to stimulate free play of our cognitive faculties, and they do not have the goal of giving us aesthetic pleasure. In both cases, then, beautiful objects appear purposive to us because they give us aesthetic pleasure in the free play of our faculties, but they also do not appear purposive because they either do not or do not seem to be done intentionally. Kant calls this relationship between our cognitive faculties and the formal qualities of objects that we judge to be beautiful as subjective purposiveness. Although it's only subjective, the purposiveness exhibited by natural beauty in particular may be interpreted as a sign that nature is hospitable to our moral interests. Moreover, Kant also interprets the experience of sublimity in nature as the following, as involving purposiveness. But in this case, it's not so much the purposiveness of nature as our own purpose or vocation as moral beings that we become aware of the experience of the sublime, in which the size and power of nature stands as a vivid contrast to the superior power of our reason. Okay. hard to actually really see where that second point is going. So it's where things can be actually beautiful, but then to actually work back to what his problem is. Third, Kant argues that reflecting judgments enable us to regard living organisms as objectively purposive, but only as a regulative principle that compensates for our ability to understand them mechanicalistically, which reflects the limitations of our cognitive faculties rather than any intrinsic teleology in nature, that is, the origin and purpose of nature. Everything's there for a reason. We cannot understand organisms speculatively because they are self-organizing beings whose parts are combined into a whole by being reciprocal to the cause and effect of their form. Oh God! In parts of a watch are so possible only through their relation to the whole, but that is because a watch is designed and produced by some rational being. An organism, by contrast, produces and sustains itself, which is inexplicable to us unless we attribute to organisms the purposes by analogy with the human art. But Kant claims that all this is only a regulative principle for reflecting judgment and to regard organisms in this way, and that we are not justified in attributing objective purposefulness to organisms themselves, since it is only, quote, because of the peculiar constitution of my cognitive faculties that I cannot judge about the possibility of those things and their generations except by thinking of cause for these acts in accordance with the intentions. Oh God. Specifically, we cannot understand how a whole can be caused, WHOLE, can be caused of its own parts because we depend on a sensible intuition for the content of our thoughts, and therefore we must think in particular intuition first before subliming under a general concept. To see this is just a limitation of the human discursive intellect. Imagine a being with an intuitive understanding whose thought does not depend, as ours does, on receiving sensory information passively, but rather creates the content of its thought in the act of thinking it. Such a divine being could understand how a whole can be the cause of its parts, and since it could grasp a whole immediately without first thinking particulars and then combining them into a whole. Therefore, since we have a discursive intellect and cannot know how things could appear to a being with an intuitive intellect, and yet can only think of organisms teleologically, which excludes mechanism, Kant now says we must think of both mechanisms and teleology, ancient cause, only as the regulative principles that we need to explain nature, rather than the constitutive principles that describe how nature is intrinsically constituted, which just as well. So he says that nature can continue on. If I get confused, it's me, it's not nature. Fourth, getting towards the end here, Kant concludes the critique of power of judgment with a long appendix arguing that reflecting judgment supports morality by leading us to think about the final end of nature, which we can only understand in moral terms, and that conversely morality enforces the teleological conception of nature. Oh yes, I suppose I can see if you've got morals, it must be to support the natural world, perhaps. Once it is granted on theoretical grounds that we must understand certain parts of nature, organisms, teleologically, although only as a regulative principle of reflecting judgment, Kant says we may go further and regard the whole of nature as a teleological system, but we can regard the whole of nature as a teleological system only by employing the idea of God, and again only regulatively, as an intelligent designer. This would attribute to Kant what attribute what Kant calls external purposiveness to nature, that is, to attribute purposes to God in creating nature. What then is God's final end in creating nature? According to Kant, the final end in nature must be human beings, but only as moral beings. God. This is because a human being used reason to set and pursue ends, using the rest of nature as a means to the ends. Moreover, Kant claims that human happiness cannot be the final end of nature, because as we have seen, he holds that happiness is not unconditionally valuable. Rather, human life has value not because of what we passively enjoy, but because of what we actively do. He can fully activate and are fully active and autonomous, however, only acting morally, which implies that God created the world so that human beings could exercise their own moral autonomy. Gee, this is really disappointing stuff. Now, since we also need happiness, this too may be admitted as a conditioned and consequent end, so that reflecting judgment eventually leads us to the highest good. But reflection, this is really all done every day. We really practice game theory and use heaps of information for this information economy. But reflection on conditions of the possibility of the highest good leads again to Kant's moral argument in the belief of God's existence. He now admits immortality, which in turn reinforces the teleological perspective of nature which reflecting judgment began. Thus Kant argues that although theoretical and practical philosophy proceed from separate and irreducible starting points, self-consciousness as the highest principle of recognition in nature, and the moral law as the basis of our knowledge and freedom, reflecting judgment unifies them into a single teleological worldview that assigns preeminent value to human autonomy. The end. Just a reflection on that one. I'll have to write that up as a podcast and get going, and I might, at 27 minutes, I'll stop now and actually do quotes for him. But look, I must admit, I was expecting everyone just going on Kant. He has inspired a lot of people by being sufficiently dense and sufficient at the right time, but he has, in a sense, gone in and done his job as a Christian philosopher and identified that indeed you need God. Have you tried God recently? Try this new God and it will solve all these problems. You can see where it's coming from, but his arguments in modern eyes come up short because just simply things have changed, where he uses a point that's only, say, a tenth of psychology or self-consciousness. It's got so much that we can say and question about it, which sort of says that Kant could only be a Kant in his own lifetime. Any other lifetime, communications, complexities, more experimental science. It was just an early science where you could build a link between science and religion. I'll now close this off by reading some quotes about Kant. So here I'll just now read through a few quotes of Kant, and it's something that we've gone through. In this episode we've done the unity of nature and freedom. So this is how it's the smiley end of the movie where the credits roll and he has to boilerplate a few ideas together, but at the end it's God takes home gold. So let's read some quotes from Kant. Science is organized knowledge, wisdom is organized life. It is beyond a doubt that all our knowledge begins with experience, which is basically what he said before. Two things awe me the most, the starry sky above me and the moral law within me. Now that is absolutely brilliant. Thoughts without content are empty. Intuitions without concepts are blind. In law, a man is guilty when he violates the rights of others. In ethics, he is guilty if he only thinks of doing so. Wow. To be is to do. That's a lovely thing. Happiness is not an idea of reason, but of imagination. Live your life as though your every act were to become a universal law. Oh, cray, that's a really hard one. Always recognize that human individuals are ends and do not use them as a means to your ends. Isn't that a beautiful quote? A means to ends, but that you use them, they are the end, and don't use them as a means. That's a beautiful quote. Experience without theory is blind, but a theory without experience is a mere intellectual play. It's not God's will merely that we should be happy, but we should make ourselves happy. Okay, well that's obviously a thing of if you've got a pursuit of the ultimate good, and ultimate good can only be done by, happiness and virtue. Immaturity in the incapacity to use one's intelligence without the guidance of another. Immaturity is that's right, isn't that beautiful? Immaturity is the incapacity to use one's intelligence without the guidance of another. It is not necessary that whilst I live happily, but it is necessary that so long as I live, I should live honourably. If a man makes himself a worm, he must not complain when he is trodden on. That's beautiful. All our knowledge begins with the senses, proceeds then to understanding, and ends with reason. There is nothing higher than reason. All the interests of my reason, speculative as well as practical, combine in three following questions. 1. What can I know? Or what ought I do? What may I hope? What a beautiful thing. I'll read that one again. All the interests of my reason, speculative as well as practical, combine the following three questions. What can I know? What ought do I do? And what can I hope? Act that your principle of action might safely be made a law of the whole world. A lie, a man annihilates his dignity as a man. By a lie, a man annihilates his dignity as a man. That is such a classic thing. So really, I think that's one I really want to use, because I'm dealing with a fair number of lies coming up, and it doesn't really affect me logically, but I think that's what you really have to say, that that lying is a real problem. Ingratitude is the essence of vileness. Seek not the favour of the multitude. It is seldom got by honest and lawful means, but seek the testimony of a few, and the number not voices, but weigh them, and few, and number not voices, but weigh them. Isn't that a beautiful story? A categorical so this is really what I'm doing here. I'm not interested in a huge podcast audience. It's just quality podcast audience. That's compliments you out there. A categorical imperative, and it's interesting that he uses category in a different term. A categorically imperative would be one which represented an action objectively necessarily as itself, without reference to another purpose. Beyond me. But although all our knowledge begins with experience, it does not flow that it arises from experiences. And I'll just read the one. By a lie, a man annihilates his dignity as a man. Isn't that beautiful? Out of timber so crooked as that which man is made, nothing entirely straight can be carved. Isn't that a beautiful story? Religion is the recognition of all our duties as divine commands. That's true about religion. He who is cruel to animals becomes hard also in his dealing with men. We can judge the heart of a man by his treatment of animals. I had therefore to remove knowledge in order to make room for belief. Wow. What can I know? What ought I do? How can I help? What can I hope? Intuition and concepts constitute the elements of all our knowledge, so that neither concepts without intuition in some way corresponding to them, nor intuition without concepts can yield knowledge. A bit strange to me. All thought must, directly or indirectly, by way of certain characters, relate ultimately to intuitions and therefore with us to sensibility, because no other way can an object be given to us. Now there's a lot of deep thought in that one, behind that one. Metaphysics is a dark ocean with shores or lighthouses strewn with many philosophical wrecks. Now that's never a truer story. Even philosophers will praise war as ennobling mankind, forgetting the Greek who said, "War is bad in that it begets more evil than it kills." Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that absolutely? So he's just saying that the Greeks say it begets more evil than it kills. The only object of practical reason are therefore those of good and evil. For by the former is meant an object necessarily desired according to the principle of reason, and the latter necessarily shunned and also according to the principle of reason. Well, that's a bit much for me to dig into my head. Nothing is divine but what is agreeable to reason. So I love that. By a lie, a man annihilates his dignity as a man. I love that quote. I think that's a really good one. So your principle of action might safely be made a law of the whole world. And it's really interesting, his idea of moral laws and stuff like that. Thanks for listening. That brings together the end of Immanuel Kant. I myself, who've just read that, power read it, have got a few things around it. His means to an end aspect of it, his idea of rationally working out that you have to be Christian, you have to believe in the afterlife, and therefore you can be happy and virtuous. And it's a great work, great group of work, and it could only have been done at this time in history. Later in history, science is broken free. It's something when you could just throw a tarp over science, wrap it up, and say, "Hey, religion is still great." But it's a really good thought, and it's a lot of technical thoughts about maxims and things like that. Thanks for listening. Another podcast, another story comes to a close. It's been a pleasure sharing this moment in time with you. May you discover truly amazing things, understand them, and tell others. Thanks for listening.